Six-step program that creates U.S. disasters. How do you stop it? The U.S. media and government take these steps over and over, and they almost always result in disaster, or at the very least do a lot of harm to America. 1. Certain U.S. government programs and policies are enacted to produce certain results. 2. Those government programs do indeed produce their intended results. Third, most Americans realize that, after all, those results are harmful to our society. 4. The mass media refuses to acknowledge that those harmful outcomes were due to the government programs that were intended to cause them. 5. Instead, the mass media claims that the bad consequences are caused by too much freedom. 6. The mass media claims that the fix for the problems created is more government programs and policies. To make it clearer, let's look at some examples. There are lots of them. Example 1. Affirmative action. U.S. government enacted programs and policies to increase the number of women in college, increase the number of women who are hired by business and government, increase the amount of money that women are paid, increase the number of women being promoted. All at the expense of men who, the leftists claim, have unfairly benefited in the past, at the expense of women. So what were the results of the government affirmative action programs and policies? Exactly what the government intended. By the 2020s. Fewer men are in college. Fewer men get jobs. Fewer men are promoted. Men's incomes decrease. So by 2024, the mass media are indeed reporting that those changes have happened. But do the media report that government programs and policies created those intended consequences? No, of course not, because that might make government look bad. On September 19, 2024, an article in the Financial Times titled, "Young Women Are Starting to Leave Men Behind," reported, men's education deficit is increasingly becoming an employment, earnings, and outcomes gap with significant repercussions. In several rich countries, young women are now more likely to be in work than young men. A few days later, an article appeared in the Wall Street Journal titled, "America's Young Men Are Falling Even Further Behind," Wall Street Journal. It reported that more women ages 25 to 34 have entered the workforce in recent years than ever. The share of young men in the labor market, meanwhile, hasn't grown in a decade. But the mass media never acknowledges that the government programs that were intended to cause those changes did indeed cause the changes. Neither the Financial Times article nor the Wall Street Journal article contain any of these words. Not a single one. Affirmative action, DEI, diversity, government. And yet we all, including the article's authors, know that vast numbers of government programs and policies were put into effect to cause this outcome. And those government programs and policies operated over a period of decades. But the mass media completely ignores the truth. The programs and policies that were intended to cause the results caused the results. Masculinity researcher. The media is determined to absolve government programs of all guilt. So the media blames society or the victims. What does the media claim is the cause of men's failure? American men never expected to have to work, masculinity researchers say. American men always expected that women would do all the work. Until the past decade or so, there was an assumption that men just needed to show up for their life and they'll get a job and have a family and be provided for because they're men, says University of Maryland masculinity researcher Kevin M. Roy. Instead of telling the truth about what caused the problems, what the mass media will do is to claim that the government must enact new programs and policies to fix the problems. Six-step cycle completed. Example 2. Depopulation. I fund population control. Bill Gates, interview with John F. Kennedy Jr. in George Magazine, 1997. The world as we know it will likely be ruined before the year 2000. World food production cannot keep pace with the galloping growth of population. The Environmental Fund, 1975, quoted in Population Control Action Institute, 2022. 6 steps to depopulation. 1. Due to the left's fake population explosion crisis, sparked by all the attention the media gave the book of that title by leftist Paul Ehrlich. Governments around the world and the UN created programs and policies to decrease population. 2. The programs and policies produced their intended consequences. Fertility rates plummeted, population started to decrease, and a depopulation crisis now emerges. 3. People begin to realize that this depopulation is a very bad thing. It is demographic doom. 4. The mass media fails to acknowledge that depopulation is a result, at the very least in part, of all those government programs and policies that were intended to cause depopulation. 5. Instead, the mass media claims that the bad consequences are caused by not enough government. 6. And the fix for depopulation is to enact more government programs and policies. One small example was Kamala Harris promised to provide a $6,000 tax credit to families with newborns. Many governments around the world have begun enacting programs to try to encourage people to have more children. China is pressing women to have more babies, reported the Wall Street Journal in 2024. Example 3. Economic growth. Politicians used to at least claim that their policies would encourage economic growth. But now government regulators enact programs and policies for degrowth. Some of us on the right may be unfamiliar with that term, but government regulators all over the world know exactly what it means, and degrowth has become their policy. It's not clear whether the leftists invented the lie of man-made climate change to justify economic degrowth, or whether economic degrowth policy was invented to prevent their fake climate change. But the two policies are certainly intertwined. In her famous speech, Greta Thunberg linked climate change to fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? So net zero also means less than zero economic growth. Now in the 2020s, Americans are beginning to experience declines in economic growth according to a number of metrics. But no one in the government or in the media will ever blame that on the government programs and policies explicitly intended to cause degrowth. Instead, the mass media will blame economic decline on capitalism and too much economic freedom, and demand new government programs and policies to fix the declining economic growth. They will never admit that government policies and programs cause the declines. Example 4. Illegal immigration, open borders. The U.S. government used to control illegal immigration across the borders pretty well. Then, without necessarily publicly announcing that it was going to stop doing that, the government stopped doing that. Instead, the government created a de facto open borders policy, including sanctuary cities and states, welfare, driver's licenses, free medical care, loaded debit cards, free hotel rooms, free transportation to American cities and towns, and so on for illegal aliens. So now America finds itself at about step 4. The negative effects of allowing massive illegal immigration and of flying or busing large numbers of illegal aliens into small towns begins to become apparent. 4. The mass media refuses to acknowledge that those harmful outcomes were due to the government programs and policies that were intended to cause them. But don't expect the media to acknowledge that the societal problems caused by massive illegal immigration are the result of government policies. Neither the mass media nor the government will admit that. Kamala Harris was never border czar, and if she was, she did a good job of controlling the borders. No. Instead, the media and government will call for more policies and programs that cost more money and that take away the money, freedoms, and rights of real Americans. Example 5. FEMA and U.S. government disaster relief. Now you see what we mean by a 6-step program to cause disasters. We were told that federally funded and controlled agencies were the best way to provide fast, effective disaster relief. Last week, when the federal government failed to provide disaster relief to hundreds of thousands of desperate people in Appalachia, private citizens moved to help the victims. The government officials, who were failing to provide aid, threatened to arrest the private citizens who actually were helping. Some people might suspect that the Fed's abandonment of Appalachia had to do with the fact that most of the victims weren't the right race to receive government aid. They were white. But was FEMA's record in New Orleans during Katrina much better? Need any more examples of the leftist government's six-step disaster program? We could provide more examples, of course, as you know. Lots more. Federal control of local school systems began in 1965 when Congress passed the Higher Education Act. Federal control of education grew when Jimmy Carter created the U.S. Department of Education. How has that federal control worked out for public education? Would the COVID disaster have happened if the federal government had not gotten control of the public health system? You get the idea. These societal disasters aren't caused by one simple thing. They are the result of a process. The six-step program to cause disasters always works. It always causes societal problems, and it is always used by the government to create more government, which causes more societal problems. Our story of the U.S. six-step disaster program goes on. This isn't the end. You can read the rest of it at Rightful Freedom on Substack.
Thank you for your interest in Rightful Freedom. Please help us grow by liking and subscribing and commenting. We would love your feedback and see more content at our website, rightfulfreedom.com.